You are in present-day Cornwall, England, living as a university archaeology student, investigating the historical truth behind Britain's greatest legend. The rain hammers against the ancient stones of Tintagel Castle ruins as you grip your metal detector, searching for proof that could rewrite history forever. The wind carries salt and secrets across the jagged cliffs, while tourists huddle in their cars below, oblivious to what you might uncover today. Your breath forms small clouds in the frigid October air, and your fingers ache from the cold seeping through your worn gloves. This is your final research expedition before submitting your thesis on Arthurian archaeology, and desperation gnaws at your stomach like hunger. 3 years of academic work, countless hours in dusty libraries, and student loans that will haunt you for decades, riding on finding something, anything, that proves the legendary king was more than medieval fantasy. Your professor, Dr. Harrison, had been clear. Find concrete evidence, or find a new thesis topic, Elric. The metal detector beeps frantically near a crumbling wall where legend claims Arthur was conceived. Your heart pounds as you brush away centuries of earth and debris, revealing something that makes your hands shake not from cold this time, but from pure disbelief. A sword hilt, ancient beyond measure, emerges from the ground like a whisper from the past. This cannot be real, you whisper to the howling wind, but your archaeological training screams otherwise. The craftsmanship is unlike anything you have studied, yet somehow familiar, as if you have seen it in dreams you cannot quite remember. Dr. Sarah Marana appeared behind you like morning mist, silent, unexpected, and carrying an air of knowing something you do not. At 35, she was the youngest professor in Celtic studies at Oxford, with platinum hair that caught light like spun silver and eyes the color of storm clouds. Students whispered she could predict exam questions with uncanny accuracy, though she always claimed it was simply thorough preparation. "Interesting find, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying a slight Welsh accent that made even mundane observations sound mystical. "Though I suspect you know this is far more significant than a random medieval artifact." You looked up from the excavation, soil still clinging to your knees. "Professor Morana, what are you doing here? Oxford is 4 hours away." She smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she knew exactly why she was here, even if you did not. Ancient sites call to those who understand their language, and Tintagel has been particularly vocal lately. The statement should have sounded ridiculous coming from an academic, but somehow it felt perfectly logical. You had been drawn here too, abandoning your original research sites despite having no logical reason to believe this location would yield anything new. "The hilt," you began, then stopped. How could you explain the strange sensation that touching it had triggered? The brief flash of images, horses charging through mist, round tables carved from massive oak, the sound of steel against steel, is calling to you, she finished quietly. "Yes, I imagine it would. May I?" You hesitated before handing over your discovery. The moment her fingers touched the ancient metal, her pupils dilated and she drew a sharp breath. For several seconds, she stood perfectly still, as if listening to something only she could hear. "We need to get this to a proper laboratory immediately," she said, her academic composure returning. "But first, there is something you should know about your family history, Elric. Something your foster parents could never have told you because they never knew themselves." The rain had stopped, but you barely noticed. "My family history, what does that have to do with anything?" Professor Marana studied your face with an intensity that made you uncomfortable. "Have you ever wondered why you were found as an infant in Glastonbury Abbey, with no record of your birth parents? Why, your foster father, the local blacksmith, always said you had old hands for someone so young." Your mouth went dry. These were details you had never shared with anyone at university private pain. You kept locked away like childhood toys you were too embarrassed to admit you still treasured. How do you know about that? Because some stories repeat themselves across centuries, and some bloodlines carry obligations that transcend time. She wrapped the hilt carefully in her scarf. The question is, are you ready to discover who you really are? Thunder rolled across the cliffs, though no lightning had flashed. In the distance, you could swear you heard the sound of horses approaching, though the nearest road was miles away. Your rational mind catalogued these impossibilities even as something deeper, more primal, recognized truth in her words. I am a archaeology student, you said, but the words felt hollow even as you spoke them. I study the past. I do not live in fairy tales. The past, Professor Marana replied, has a way of becoming the present when it has unfinished business. As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from behind the ancient walls, a man, perhaps 40 years old, moving with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in boardrooms and battlefields. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and he wore an expensive charcoal suit that somehow looked perfectly natural among the medieval ruins. Marana, he said simply, his voice carrying an authority that made you automatically straighten your shoulders. You found him. The bloodline remembers itself. Marcus, she replied, even when the mind forgets. Marcus studied you with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything: your stance, your breathing, the way you instinctively shifted to keep both strangers in your peripheral vision. Elric Blackwood, 22 years old, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in medieval history before beginning your graduate work in archaeology, raised by Thomas and Mary Blackwood of Glastonbury after being discovered at the Abbey as an infant. How do you know these things? Marcus smiled, but it held no warmth. Because it is my responsibility to know, just as it is my responsibility to prepare you for what comes next. Which is what, exactly? You were growing tired of cryptic statements and mysterious knowledge. Look, I appreciate the academic interest, but I have a thesis to complete and a sword hilt to properly analyze. If you will excuse me, the sword hilt, Marcus interrupted, is authentic, 6th century, forged using techniques that should not have existed for another 300 years. The molecular composition of the steel includes trace elements found only in specific mines that were depleted by the 8th century. You stared at him. That is impossible to know without proper laboratory analysis. I had it tested 15 years ago, he said simply, along with 12 other similar artifacts found across Britain, all authentic, all connected to the same historical period, all pointing to the same conclusion that academia refuses to accept. Professor Marana placed a gentle hand on your shoulder. Elric, what would you say if I told you that King Arthur was not only real, but that his bloodline survived? That the Round Table was not a fairy tale, but a necessary organization that still operates today? I would say you have been reading too much fantasy fiction. And what if I told you, Marcus added, stepping closer, that 6 months ago, 3 separate intelligence agencies detected unusual activity across Britain, ancient sites experiencing electromagnetic anomalies, archaeological discoveries appearing overnight in locations that were thoroughly surveyed just days before, historical artifacts surfacing with impossible provenance, your scientific training ward with growing unease? Coincidence, or hoaxes designed to attract tourism? Perhaps, Marcus conceded, or perhaps something that has slept for 15 centuries is beginning to wake up, and perhaps it needs its rightful king to face what is coming. The metal detector at your feet began beeping frantically, though you had turned it off 10 minutes ago. All 3 of you looked down to see the device's display cycling through readings that made no scientific sense, detecting metals that should not exist, registering electromagnetic signatures that defied physics. That, Professor Marana said quietly, is why we are here, and why you, Elric Blackwood, are going to have to choose between the safe life of academic research and accepting a destiny that will change everything. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the distinct scent of wood smoke and horses' impossible aromas that belonged to another age entirely. In the distance, you thought you saw movement among the ruins, shadows that moved independently of any light source. This is insane, you whispered. But even as you said it, you knew you would follow them wherever they led. The sword hilt had awakened something in you, some recognition that transcended logic or reason. Marcus extended his hand. Insane situations require insane courage. The question is, do you have it? As you reached out to shake his hand, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the clouds, and Tintagel Castle was plunged into darkness so complete it seemed solid. But instead of feeling afraid, you felt, for the first time in your life, like you were exactly where you belonged. "Tell me everything," you said. And with those words, the legend began again. The drive to Oxford should have taken 4 hours, but Professor Marana navigated shortcuts through countryside that seemed older and more mysterious than you remembered from previous visits. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of her vintage Land Rover, occasionally murmuring directions in what sounded like Welsh, though you caught familiar words that made no logical sense. Avalon, Round Table, and most disturbing of all, Excalibur. "Where exactly are we going?" you asked from the back seat, still cradling the wrapped sword hilt like a sleeping infant. "Somewhere that does not officially exist," Marcus replied without turning around, "though you will find it on no government records. The organization I represent has operated continuously since the 6th century. We simply ... adapted with the times." You wanted to laugh, but something about the way shadows moved differently here. The way your phone had lost signal the moment you left Tintagel made humor feel inappropriate. "And this organization is the Round Table," Professor Marana said simply, "though these days we call ourselves the Camelot Foundation. Much better for tax purposes." The road wound through villages that appeared untouched by the 21st century thatched cottages with genuine medieval foundations, stone circles that predated Christ, forests where the trees grew in patterns that hurt your eyes if you stared too long. Your archaeology training catalogued dozens of sites that should have been protected landmarks, yet they appeared on no official surveys. "How is this possible?" you murmured, watching a group of standing stones that definitely had not existed when you studied this region last spring. "These sites ... they are appearing." "Not appearing," Marcus corrected, "revealing themselves. There is a difference. Ancient magic hand, yes, I know how that sounds to your rational mind, often hides in plain sight. It takes recognition to see it properly. Magic is not real." Professor Marana caught your eye in the rearview mirror. 3 hours ago, you would have said King Arthur was not real either, yet here you sit, holding proof that suggests otherwise. The Land Rover crested a hill, and below you stretched a valley that took your breath away. A massive estate sprawled across perfectly manicured grounds, combining architectural elements that should have clashed horribly medieval castle towers rising beside Georgian manor wings. Modern glass extensions reflecting ancient stone circles, all somehow harmonizing into something that looked both timeless and futuristic. "Welcome," Marcus said, "to Camelot." The great hall defied every principle of physics you understood. It was simultaneously vast and intimate, ancient and cutting edge, filled with artifacts that made your academic heart race and technology that belonged in science fiction films. Medieval tapestries hung beside digital displays showing real-time data from archaeological sites worldwide. A massive round table dominated the center knot, the tourist attraction you had expected, but something carved from single piece of oak so large, the tree would have been 1,000 years old when it was felled. The original round table was destroyed in the 15th century, explained a woman who appeared beside you with the same unsettling silence that seemed common among these people. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair braided in a style that looked both practical and elegant, wearing modern clothes that somehow suggested chainmail underneath. This one was carved from the same grove where the original tree grew. "Alina Pemberton," she introduced herself, extending a hand calloused in ways that spoke of swordwork rather than computer keyboards. "I suppose you could call me a knight of the Round Table, though these days my official title is Director of Historical Preservation. You shook her hand, noting strength that rivaled professional athletes. You are serious about this, all of you, deadly serious. Alina gestured toward the table, where several other individuals had gathered, each carrying themselves with the same combination of academic authority and warrior readiness. We are the inheritors of Arthur's original vision, gathering the best and brightest to protect Britain from threats most people cannot imagine. Threats like what? Like the return of magic to a world unprepared for it, said a new voice. The man approaching was younger than the others, perhaps 25, but carried himself with nervous energy that suggested barely contained power. He wore priest's collar beneath a worn leather jacket, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. Father Thomas Brennan, though most people just call me Tommy. I represent the church's unofficial interest in these matters. You looked around the assembled group. The church knows about this. Some elements within the church, Tommy corrected. The same elements that have spent 15 centuries preserving certain manuscripts the Vatican prefers to keep buried. Turns out, early Christianity and Celtic magic were far more intertwined than modern theology cares to admit. Marcus moved to stand behind one of the chairs arranged around the massive table. Elric, you asked what we do here. The simple answer is, we investigate, contain, and when necessary, combat supernatural threats to Britain and the wider world. The complex answer is that we are the last guardians of a very old covenant. Covenant with whom? With the land itself, Professor Morana replied, settling into another chair. Celtic Britain was never fully conquered, no, by Romans, not by Saxons, not by Normans. The old powers went underground, literally and figuratively. Arthur's original Round Table was humanity's first attempt to work with those powers rather than against them. Alina pulled out a tablet and began swiping through images that made your breath catch. Photographs of stone circles activating with visible energy, ancient swords found in impossible locations, people demonstrating abilities that belonged in superhero films rather than reality. 6 months ago, everything changed, she continued. Dormant sites across Britain began showing signs of activity. Artifacts started surfacing. People with no previous supernatural experiences began manifesting abilities their ancestors possessed centuries ago. People like me, you asked, though you were not sure why. People exactly like you, Marcus confirmed. Descendants of bloodlines that carry genetic memories, inherited responsibilities, and in some cases, inherited powers that skip generations until they are needed. Tommy leaned forward, his expression intense. Something is coming, Elric. We do not know what yet, but every divination method we have tried, Christian, Celtic, even some techniques borrowed from other traditions, points to the same conclusion. Britain faces a threat that will require Arthur's return. Arthur is dead, you said automatically. He died 15 centuries ago. Arthur the man, yes, Professor Morana agreed. But Arthur the archetype, Arthur the embodiment of righteous kingship, Arthur the bridge between human and otherworldly power that never died. It simply waited for the right moment to return. She reached across the table and unwrapped the sword hilt you had discovered. Under the hall's strange lighting, it seemed to pulse with inner fire, and you could swear you heard whispers in languages you did not recognize. This is not just any artifact, she continued. This is the hilt of Caliburn, the sword Arthur drew from the stone. Not Excalibur, which came later, but the first blade that proved his right to rule. How can you possibly know that? Because, said a new voice from the shadows near the hall's entrance, I forged it myself. The man who stepped into the light defied easy categorization, ancient beyond measure, yet moving with vitality that suggested prime physical condition. His hair was silver white, his beard braided with what looked like actual silver threads, and his eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. Marion Emrys, he introduced himself with a slight bow. though history remembers me by another name. I believe modern psychology would classify me as suffering from extreme longevity combined with periodic amnesia. But in simpler terms, I am Merlin. You stared at him. That is impossible. Most interesting things are, Marion replied cheerfully. I died twice, went completely mad for roughly 3 centuries, spent another 200 years as a Trevory restful, actually, and have been gradually remembering who I am for the past 50 years. Modern therapy has been surprisingly helpful. You are seriously claiming to be a 1500-year-old wizard. Technically, I am claiming to be a 1500-year-old consultant in applied metaphysics with a specialty in Arthurian monarchy and legendary weapon maintenance. Marion grinned. But yes, wizard works too. He approached the table and placed both hands on either side of the sword hilt. The moment his fingers made contact, the entire hall filled with light that seemed to emanate from the oak table itself. The whispers you had heard became clearer, not words exactly, but emotions, memories, the weight of history pressing against the present moment. Caliburn recognizes its maker, Marion said softly. More importantly, it recognizes its rightful wielder. His ancient eyes fixed on yours. The question, young Arthur, and yes, that is who you are. Whether you accept it or not, whether you are ready to claim what was always yours. I am not Arthur, you protested, even as something deep inside you stirred in recognition. I am Elric Blackwood, archaeology graduate student from Glastonbury. You are Elric Arthur Pendragon, Marcus said quietly, pulling out a thick folder. DNA analysis confirms it. Your blood carries markers found in remains attributed to Uther Pendragon. Your foster parents found you at Glastonbury Abbey, because that is where the surviving members of Arthur's bloodline have hidden their children for generations when the times became too dangerous, Tommy added. The church records we preserved include a genealogy that traces your line directly back to the original Arthur's sister. You are not a reincarnation, you are a descendant, carrying the genetic and mystical inheritance of Britain's greatest king. You felt the world tilting around you, reality reshaping itself into patterns that terrified and thrilled you simultaneously. Why now? Why is this happening now? Alina's tablet chimed, and her expression grew grave as she read the incoming message. Because our enemies have returned as well. I am receiving reports of unusual activity across Europe, ancient sites in France, activating. Germanic tribes that should not exist anymore, moving through the Black Forest. Something that might be a dragon spotted over the Swiss Alps. Dragon, you asked weakly. Dragons, Marion corrected, are simply what medieval minds called creatures from the other world when they lacked proper scientific vocabulary. Though I admit, some of them do breathe fire and collect treasure, so the basic description was reasonably accurate. Professor Marana stood and moved to a map of Britain that covered one entire wall. Red dots marked dozens of locations, blinking in patterns that suggested coordination. Aaron Pendragon surfaced 3 days ago, she announced, and the entire room fell silent. Arthur's half-brother, the one history forgot because we worked very hard to make sure it did. Our sources confirm he has been gathering followers, people who believe Britain's problems stem from its acceptance of foreign influences, foreign religions, foreign bloodlines. A racist cult leader, you said, trying to process this information through familiar frameworks. A racist cult leader, Marcus agreed, who possesses legitimate magical abilities, commands resources we are still trying to identify, and believes his divine mission is to purge Britain of everything that is not authentically ancient and pure, including the Round Table, which he sees as contaminated by Christian influences. Tommy's face had gone pale. He is not wrong about our Christian connections, unfortunately. Arthur's original vision included finding harmony between Celtic tradition and the new faith. Aaron sees that as weakness. More than that, Marion added grimly, he sees it as betrayal. In his mind, Arthur sold out the old ways for political convenience. He intends to correct that mistake by becoming the king Arthur should have been: pure, uncompromising, and utterly devoted to driving out every foreign element from British soil. Alina pulled up satellite images on her tablet. Intelligence suggests he is targeting specific sites, places where the boundary between our world and the other world is traditionally thin. If he can control those access points, he can awaken things that have slept since Arthur's time. Professor Morana finished. Creatures and powers that could devastate modern civilization, which lacks both the knowledge and the defenses to protect itself. You looked around the table at these impossible people with their impossible story, then down at the sword hilt that seemed to pulse with your heartbeat. And you think, I can stop him. We think, Marcus said carefully, that you are the only one who can stop him. Arthur's bloodline carries more than just genetic markers, carries the right to command certain powers, to speak for the land itself when Britain is threatened. But I do not know how to do any of that. No, Marion agreed cheerfully, but I do. And for the first time in 5 centuries, I remember how to teach it. Thunder rolled across the valley outside, though no storm clouds had been visible moments before. Through the great hall's windows, you could see lights moving across the grounds. Not electric lights, but something older and wilder. The other world is waking up, Alina observed, and it wants to know whether we have a king worth following. You reached out and touched the sword hilt with one finger. The moment contact was made, the world exploded into sensation memories that were not yours. Knowledge you had never learnt, a sense of connection to every stone and stream and growing thing across the British Isles. I accept, you heard yourself saying, though you had not consciously made the decision. I do not understand what I am accepting, but I accept it. Marion clapped his hands together with obvious delight. Excellent. Now, the real work begins. First lesson, how to pull a sword from a stone without looking like you were straining. Surprisingly technical, actually. As laughter and relief filled the ancient hall, you wondered what you had gotten yourself into. But for the first time since childhood, you felt like you were exactly where you belonged. The training began at dawn, which came far too early for someone whose academic schedule had never required rising before 9. Marion led you through morning mist, across grounds that seemed to shift when you were not looking directly at them, gardens that contained plants from every era of British history, training yards where medieval targets stood beside modern obstacle courses, and stone circles that hummed with energy that made your teeth ache. Kingship, Marion explained as you stumbled along behind him, is not about wearing a crown and sitting on a throne. It is about becoming a conduit between the land and the people, a bridge between what was and what must be. That sounds very philosophical for 6 in the morning, you grumbled, still not fully awake despite the coffee Professor Morana had provided. Philosophy becomes practical when you can literally feel the emotional state of every living thing within a 10-mile radius. Marion replied cheerfully, which, by the way, you will be able to do once we unlock your dormant abilities. Fair warning, the first time it happens, most people vomit. You stopped walking. I am going to what? Vomit. Quite spectacularly, in my experience. The sudden influx of sensory data overwhelms the nervous system. Perfectly normal response to supernatural awakening. He paused and looked back at you with concern. You did eat breakfast, did you not? Because doing this on an empty stomach is much worse. Before you could respond, Alina appeared from behind a standing stone you could have sworn was unoccupied moments before. She was dressed in what looked like a cross between yoga clothes and armor, flexible black material that somehow suggested both comfort and protection. How much have you told him about the physical aspects? She asked Marion. We were just getting to the vomiting part. Wonderful. Alina turned to you with the expression of someone who regularly delivered bad news. Elric, what Marion is not mentioning is that awakening dormant. Magical abilities in someone with royal bloodline is roughly equivalent to connecting a standard household outlet directly to a power plant. It works, but the process is intense. Define intense. Well, when I manifested my abilities, AM descended from Gareth. One of Arthur's original knights I accidentally set fire to my university dormitory, lifted a car 3 feet off the ground, and briefly turned invisible, all while unconscious. You stared at her. You set fire to a building while unconscious. Small fire, she said defensively, and I paid for the damages. Marion nodded sagely. Much better than my awakening, actually. When I first manifested, I accidentally turned an entire forest into crystalline formations. Took decades to sort that out. Beautiful, though looked like a fairy tale. This is supposed to be reassuring. Not particularly, admitted a new voice. Father Tommy emerged from what appeared to be morning prayers near a small chapel that combined Christian crosses with significantly older symbols. But it is honest, which matters more in the long run. He approached your group with the easy gait of someone comfortable in multiple worlds. Good morning, Elric. How are you feeling about all this in the cold light of day? You considered the question seriously, terrified, excited, completely overwhelmed, like I might be losing my mind. Excellent, Tommy said with genuine approval. Anyone who is not terrified by discovering they are the reincarnation of Britain's greatest legendary king is either lying or lacks imagination. I am not a reincarnation, you corrected automatically. I am a descendant. Are you? Marion asked mildly, because the magical signatures suggest otherwise. Reincarnation and genetic inheritance often work together in ways that linear thinking cannot accommodate. Before you could process that disturbing statement, Professor Marana appeared at your elbow seriously. Did everyone here move like ghosts? Carrying a leather satchel that radiated the same strange energy as the sword hilt. Time for your first real test, she announced. We need to determine exactly what abilities you carry, how powerful they are, and most importantly, how quickly we can teach you to control them. Because Marcus materialized from the direction of the main building, his business suit replaced by clothing that looked both modern and somehow timeless. Because our intelligence network reports that Aaron made his first major move 3 hours ago. He attacked a site in Wales, Dinas Emrys. The legendary fortress of Merlinan successfully awakened something that has been dormant for centuries. What kind of something, you asked, though you suspected you did not want to know. A tile with Teg warband, Professor Marana replied grimly. What English folklore calls fairy folk, though that term vastly understates their capabilities. Think warriors from the other world with technology that operates on principles we barely understand. Alina pulled out her tablet, showing aerial footage that looked like something from a fantasy film. Figures moving through Welsh countryside with inhuman speed and grace, leaving behind plant growth that definitely had not existed hours before. Animals behaving in ways that defied natural behavior patterns. They are not inherently hostile, Tommy explained, but they follow whoever holds legitimate authority in their eyes. Aaron convinced them that he represents the true heir of ancient Britain, and you want me to challenge him to some kind of magical duel? Eventually, yes, Marion said. But first, we need to make sure you can survive the experience, hence the training. He led your group to a circular clearing, surrounded by standing stones that definitely had not been there yesterday. In the center sat a boulder roughly the size of a small car, with what appeared to be a sword blade buried deep in its heart. Behold, Marion announced with theatrical flourish, the Stone of Destiny. Not the original, that one is safely housed in Westminster Abbey, but a working replica that carries the same enchantments. You approached the stone cautiously. The sword blade was beautiful in the way that truly ancient craftsmanship could be. Every line perfect, the metal showing no signs of age, despite obviously being centuries old. This is not Caliborn, you observed. Correct. This is Excalibur the blade the Lady of the Lake gave Arthur after Caliborn was broken in his first great battle. Different sword, different purpose, different magic. What kind of different magic? Professor Marana stepped forward, her academic demeanor shifting into something older and more primal. Caliborn was forged to prove kingship. It chose Arthur and proclaimed his right to rule. Excalibur was forged to defend kingship. It carries the power to protect not just the wielder, but everything the wielder holds dear. In practical terms, Alina added, Caliborn could cut through any earthly obstacle. Excalibur can cut through anything at all, including barriers between dimensions, magical shields, and certain types of time displacement. Time displacement? Do not ask, Tommy said quickly. We are still sorting out some of Marian's experiments from the 19th century. You circled the stone, studying the sword from every angle. How do I know if I can actually pull it out? You will know, Marian said simply. The blade calls to its rightful wielder. If you are truly, Arthur returned, Excalibur will sing for you. You placed both hands on the leather-wrapped hilt and immediately understood what he meant. The sword did not just feel familiar, it felt like an extension of your own body, as natural as your heartbeat or breathing. Power flowed through the connection, not overwhelming, but vast and patient and utterly loyal. I can feel it, you whispered. I can feel everything, the land, the people, things that are moving in the other world, ... Then draw the blade, Professor Morana urged. Claim what has always been yours. You pulled gently, and Excalibur slid from the stone like silk through water. The moment it cleared the boulder completely, light exploded across the clearing, not harsh, artificial illumination, but something warm and golden that seemed to come from the sword itself. Every standing stone in the circle began to glow in response. The ground beneath your feet hummed with energy that felt like a massive engine awakening after long sleep. In the distance, you could hear church bells ringing, though the nearest village was miles away. Well, Marian said with obvious satisfaction, that settles the identity question rather definitively. Alina was checking her tablet with growing excitement. Elric, you need to see this. Every ancient site in Britain just registered simultaneous energy spikes. Stonehenge, Avebury, the Giant's Causeway, Hadrian's Wall, all of them responding to you claiming Excalibur. Is that good or bad? Both, Marcus replied grimly. Good because it confirms your legitimacy beyond any doubt. Bad because it just announced your return to every supernatural entity in Europe. Aaron will know exactly where you are and exactly what you represent. As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed across the valley, hunting horns, blown in harmonies that belonged to no earthly instruments. The mist around the clearing began to thicken, and shadows moved within it that were far too large to be cast by anything human. Training time is over, Professor Morana announced, her voice carrying new authority. The other world has taken notice, and the real game begins now. Tommy was already moving toward the main building. I will contact our allies and activate our defensive protocols. If Aaron is coming, we need to be ready. He will not come here directly, Marian said thoughtfully. Too many protections, too much risk of collateral damage to his own cause. But he will test you first, send challenges, threats, demonstrations of power designed to make you doubt yourself. You lifted Excalibur, feeling its weight as both weapon and responsibility. What kind of challenges? The kind, Alina said, studying new messages on her tablet that are apparently already beginning. We have reports of supernatural activity in London, creatures moving through the underground tunnels, electronics failing in patterns that suggest magical interference, witnesses describing knights in black armor appearing in locations associated with Arthurian legend. He is forcing you to choose, Marcus realized. Stay here safely while innocent people suffer, or enter the field before your training is complete. The hunting horns sounded again, closer this time, and definitely coming from multiple directions. Whatever was approaching had surrounded the estate. No choice at all, really, you said, surprised by your own calm certainty. We go to London. We stop whatever Aaron is doing. We protect the people who cannot protect themselves. That, Marian said with approval, is exactly what Arthur would say. Professor Morana smiled, but it held edges of sadness. Just remember, accepting the crown means accepting everything that comes with it. The power, the responsibility, and the knowledge that every choice you make will affect millions of people. You looked around at these impossible people who had become your companions, your knights, your advisors, in the space of 24 hours. Then I suppose we had better make good choices. Thunder rolled overhead, though the sky remained clear. In the distance, London waited 8 million people going about their daily lives, unaware that their safety now depended on a university student who had discovered he was the heir to a legend. To London, then, you said, raising Excalibur toward the sky. Let us remind the world what the Round Table stands for. The sword blazed with light that could be seen for miles, a beacon announcing that Arthur had returned and the real battle was about to begin. London in the early evening should have been a symphony of traffic, tourists, and the general chaos of 8 million people pursuing their daily lives. Instead, as your convoy approached the city limits, an unnatural silence had settled over everything like a suffocating blanket. The electromagnetic interference is getting worse, Alina reported from the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, her tablet flickering between readings that made no scientific sense. Mobile networks are down across central London. The underground has been suspended due to technical difficulties, and the BBC is reporting equipment failures at every major broadcast facility. You sat in the back of the armoured Range Rover parallelly. The Round Table had modernized their transportation since the days of horses watching familiar landmarks transform into something alien and threatening. The Thames reflected no light despite the setting sun. Street lamps flickered in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code, and pedestrians moved with the jerky, uncertain steps of people trying to navigate while their smartphones provided no guidance. How many people know what is really happening? You asked Marcus, who was coordinating with their London operatives through a radio system that apparently operated on frequencies Aaron's interference could not affect. Officially, none. The government line is coordinated infrastructure failures caused by solar flare activity. Marcus's expression suggested what he thought of that explanation. Unofficially, every intelligence service in Europe has people asking very uncomfortable questions about phenomena their science cannot explain. Professor Marana leaned forward from the third row of seats. The important thing is that most civilians are following instructions to stay indoors. Whatever Aaron has planned, he does not want witnesses, which suggests it involves elements that would shatter the general public's understanding of reality. Elements like what? Like that, Tommy said quietly, pointing through the windscreen toward Westminster Bridge. Rising from the Thames, like something from humanity's darkest nightmares, came a ship that belonged to no earthly navy. Its hull seemed carved from single piece of black stone. Sails billowed despite no wind, and figures moved across its deck with the fluid grace of predators. As you watched, it glided silently beneath the bridge, heading toward the Tower of London with obvious purpose. Aaron found himself some interesting allies, Marion observed from the front passenger seat. He had changed from his casual academic clothes into robes that seemed woven from starlight and shadow, and his entire demeanor had shifted from friendly professor to something ancient and dangerous. That vessel belongs to the Wild Hunt Otherworld warriors, who serve whoever can prove themselves worthy through combat, and they are heading for the tower because, Alina said grimly, checking her intelligence feeds, that is where the crown jewels are kept. Specifically, the St. Edward's crown, which was forged using metal from the original crown of Arthur Pendragon. You felt Excalibur pulse against your back where it hung in its specially designed sheath. He wants to crown himself king, with the legitimate regalia. Yes, it would give him a claim that even the otherworld powers would be forced to acknowledge. Marcus was already redirecting their route. We need to reach the tower before he does. What about the yeoman warders, the tourists, the ravens? You had visited the Tower of London on school trips, remembered it as a bustling historical site filled with families and tour groups, evacuated 3 hours ago due to gas leak concerns. Tommy reported, monitoring official emergency channels. Though our sources inside suggest the ravens are still there and behaving very strangely. As your convoy raced through streets that grew emptier with each passing block, you began to understand the scope of what Aaron had accomplished. This was not random supernatural chaos. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to isolate and claim the symbols of British monarchy, while the modern world stood paralyzed by technologies it could not comprehend. He has done this before, you realized. Not here, not in this time, but he understands how to wage this kind of warfare. Aaron spent centuries in the other world after Arthur's death. Professor Marana confirmed he had time to study, to plan, to gather allies who share his vision of purified Britain. We are not facing a madman with delusions of grandeur. We are facing a strategic mind that has had 1,500 years to prepare for this moment. The Tower of London loomed ahead, its ancient stones somehow darker against the evening sky than they should have been. The modern tourists' facilities stood empty, but the medieval fortress itself seemed more present, more real than usual as if Aaron's magic was stripping away centuries of accumulated civilization to reveal the raw power beneath. I count at least 20 figures moving across the grounds, Alina reported, switching her tablet to thermal imaging. Human-sized, but their heat signatures are all wrong to hot in some places, too cold in others. Tile with Teg warriors, Marion identified. They wear glamour that makes them appear human to casual observation, but their true forms are significantly more impressive. Your convoy pulled into the tower's courtyard, and immediately you understood that stepping out of these vehicles would change everything. This was not going to be a negotiation or a civilized confrontation. This was going to be battle, with real weapons and real consequences. Last chance to reconsider, Marcus said seriously. Once we engage, there is no going back. Win or lose, the world will never be quite the same. You drew Excalibur, feeling its weight settle into your hand like a missing piece of yourself clicking into place. The world changed the moment I pulled this sword from the stone. We are just acknowledging reality now. As your companions prepared their own weapons, Lena producing a sword that gleamed with inner light, Tommy drawing what appeared to be a blessed silver blade, Professor Marana revealing runes tattooed along her arms that began to glow with soft blue fire. You felt the weight of history pressing down like a physical force. For Britain, you said quietly. For the Round Table, they replied in unison. And with that ancient battle cry, you charged toward the Tower of London to face whatever waited in the gathering darkness. The ravens were the first sign that reality had shifted into something beyond normal understanding. Instead of the usual handful of large black birds maintained by the tower, hundreds filled the courtyard, ravens the size of eagles, their eyes gleaming with intelligence that seemed almost human, watching your approach with obvious recognition. They know you, Marion observed with satisfaction. Ravens remember bloodlines across centuries. They are acknowledging Arthur's return. The massive birds parted before your advance like a living corridor, their cores creating harmonies that sounded suspiciously like ancient Celtic war songs. Behind them, the tower's famous yeoman warders stood at their posts, but these were not the friendly tourist guides you remembered from childhood visits. These warders moved with the precision of supernatural guardians, their traditional uniforms somehow more vibrant, their ceremonial weapons gleaming with edges that suggested they were far more than decorative. When they saw Excalibur in your hands, they snapped to attention with synchronized movements that belonged to another age entirely. Your Majesty, their leader said simply, and the words carried weight that made the air itself seem thicker. We have been waiting. Waiting for what? For the rightful king to claim what was always his. The man, ancient beyond his apparent years, gestured toward the white tower that dominated the fortress complex. The crown waits above, but it is not unguarded. Through the tower's windows, you could see lights moving in patterns that definitely had nothing to do with electric illumination. Shadows danced across medieval stone in ways that suggested occupancy by things that cast no normal shadows. Aaron, you asked, and his chosen champions, the yeoman confirmed. 3 of them warriors from the other world who have accepted his claim to kingship. You will have to face them in single combat before you can approach the crown. Alina stepped forward, her sword already drawn. Not single combat, we stand with Arthur. As is proper, the yeoman agreed. But the challenges must be faced in the ancient way, one at a time, each testing a different aspect of worthiness, strength, wisdom, and finally, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the good of the realm. Tommy was studying the tower with eyes that seemed to see more than normal vision should allow. The entire structure has been transformed into a testing ground. I can feel the weight of the enchantments from here. Professor Morana nodded grimly. Aaron is forcing you to prove your worthiness according to the oldest laws. If you fail any of the tests, you forfeit not just your claim to the crown, but your life. And if I pass, then, Marion said with a smile that held edges of anticipation, you become what Arthur always was, not just a king, but a bridge between the human world and the powers that shaped this land before humanity existed. A sound echoed from the White Tower hunting horns blown in harmonies that made your bones vibrate. The first challenge was beginning. Remember, Marcus said, as your group approached the tower's entrance, you are not facing this alone. We may not be able to fight beside you in the formal challenges, but we will be there for everything else. The massive door swung open without anyone touching it, revealing corridors lit by torches that burned without fuel and cast shadows that moved independently of their flames. Somewhere in the darkness above, something that had once been human was laughing with the sound of breaking glass. Well, you said, raising Excalibur until its blade caught and reflected the impossible torchlight. Let us see what it takes to become a king. Behind you, the ravens began to sing, if bird sounds could be called singing, in harmonies that seemed to carry the voices of every Arthur who had ever lived, every hero who had ever stood between Britain and the darkness pressing against its borders. The legend was becoming real again, and this time, you were going to make sure it ended the right way. The first chamber of the White Tower defied every principle of architecture you understood. What should have been a medieval hall had transformed into something vast and primal, vaulted ceilings that disappeared into star-filled darkness, walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift when you looked directly at them, and at the center, a fighting circle marked with stones that pulsed with inner fire. Your first challenger waited in the circle's heart. He stood 9 feet tall if he stood an inch, muscles rippling beneath skin that seemed carved from polished bronze, wearing armor that looked like it had been forged from captured lightning. When he turned to face you, his eyes held the cold intelligence of something that had never been entirely human. I am Balaka of the Iron Hills. His voice boomed across the impossible space. Champion of the old blood, sworn to serve the true heir of Pendragon. Face me in combat, pretender, and prove your strength worthy of the crown you seek to claim. Cheerful fellow, Alina muttered from behind you. She and the others had been allowed to enter, but could proceed no further. Ancient law required the challenges be faced alone. You stepped into the fighting circle, feeling Excalibur's weight shift subtly as the blade responded to the magic that saturated this space. I am Elric Arthur Pendragon, heir to the throne of Britain, and I accept your challenge. Balaka drew a sword that seemed forged from the same material as his armor, living metal that crackled with barely contained energy. Then let us see if you can back up that claim with action. He moved with speed that should have been impossible for something his size. One moment he stood 20 feet away, the next his blade was whistling toward your head with force that would have split a normal sword in half. Only Excalibur's supernatural sharpness allowed you to parry the blow, though the impact drove you to one knee. Is that all? Balaka taunted, pressing his attack with systematic brutality. Arthur of legend could cleave mountains with his blade. You can barely keep your feet. He was right, and you knew it. Your body carried Arthur's bloodline, but not his experience, not his training, not the muscle memory of countless battles. You were an archaeology student with 3 hours of hasty instruction trying to fight a warrior who had perfected his craft across centuries. But as Balakor's next strike came whistling toward your ribs, something shifted in your awareness. The fighting circle was not just an arena yet, was a teaching tool designed to awaken abilities that lay dormant in royal blood. Each exchange of blows taught you something new. Each desperate parry unlocked reflexes you had never known you possessed. Better, your opponent admitted as you managed to slip past his guard and score a shallow cut across his arm. But still not enough. His counterattack came with redoubled fury, forcing you back to the circle's edge. One more step and you would be outside the boundary, which ancient law dictated meant forfeit of the challenge. Balakor knew it to his bronze features, split in a predatory grin as he prepared the finishing blow. That was when you stopped thinking like Elric the student and started thinking like Arthur the king. The revelation came like lightning. This was not about personal combat prowess. It was about understanding that a true king's strength came from connection to something larger than himself. You reached out with senses you had not known you possessed, feeling the weight of every person in London who was counting on you, the pressure of 15 centuries of expectation, the solid presence of the land itself rising to support its chosen defender. Power flowed through Excalibur like liquid fire. When you met Balakor's final charge, your blade moved with precision that belonged to legend rather than reality. His sword, forged from captured lightning, shattered against Excalibur's edge like glass against stone. Impossible, he breathed, staring at the broken hilt in his hands. Not impossible, he replied, though the voice that emerged carried harmonics that were not entirely your own. Inevitable. A king's strength is not his alone, it belongs to everyone he serves. Balakor knelt, his massive frame somehow graceful despite its size. I acknowledge the test passed, Arthur Pendragon. May your wisdom prove as great as your strength. The fighting circle dissolved around you, stone and fire melting back into normal medieval masonry. Your companions rushed forward, but you waved them back. The challenges were not finished, and maintaining focus required solitude. How do you feel? Professor Marana called. Different, you admitted. Like something that was sleeping inside me just woke up, and it was true. The physical connection to Excalibur had deepened during the combat, but more than that, you could feel Britain itself, not as an abstract concept, but as a living entity with needs and desires and hopes for the future. The responsibility was staggering, but so was the sense of rightness, of finally understanding what you were meant to do with your life. A staircase had appeared where none existed before, spiraling upward into darkness that seemed to whisper with voices from across centuries. Your second challenge waited above. The second chamber was a library that defied physics even more dramatically than the fighting circle had. Books floated freely through the air, their pages turning themselves as if read by invisible scholars. Scrolls unrolled and re-rolled in complex patterns that suggested some vast cataloging system beyond human comprehension. At the room's center sat a woman who looked perhaps 30, though her eyes held depths that spoke of millennia. I am Nemu of the Seven Realms, she said, without looking up from the tome hovering before her. Guardian of all knowledge that has been lost, all wisdom that has been forgotten, all truths that must be remembered. Your second test is not of strength, but of understanding. She gestured to 3 pedestals that materialized from the library's impossible geometry. On each rested a different objector: simple wooden cup, a ornate golden chalice, and a crystal vessel that seemed to contain its own internal starfield. One of these is the Holy Grail, Nemu continued. The cup that caught Christ's blood, that grants eternal life to the worthy, that has been the object of quests for 15 centuries. Choose correctly, and you demonstrate the wisdom necessary to rule. Choose incorrectly ... and you spend eternity in this library. adding your own story to the collection of those who thought they knew better than they actually did. You approached the pedestals carefully, studying each vessel with eyes that were beginning to see more than purely physical details. The wooden cup radiated simplicity and humility. It looked like something a carpenter might have used for daily meals. The golden chalice was magnificent, covered in jewels and engravings that depicted biblical scenes with extraordinary detail. The crystal vessels seemed to exist partially in this dimension and partially somewhere else entirely. This is a trick question, you realized after several minutes of examination. Nimue smiled. Explain. The real test is not identifying which cup is the grail, it is understanding what the grail actually represents. You gestured to all three vessels. Each of these could be the cup Christ used at the Last Supper, depending on how you define cup and Christ and Last Supper. Continue. The wooden cup represents humility and service, the idea that true kingship means putting others before yourself. The golden chalice represents the institutional church, the way human organizations try to capture divine truth in earthly splendor. The crystal vessel represents the mystical aspect, the idea that some truths can only be experienced, never fully understood. Nemu's smile widened. And which do you choose? All of them, you said firmly, because wisdom lies in understanding that truth has many faces, and a king must be able to see from multiple perspectives simultaneously, even when those perspectives contradict each other. Especially then, you thought of the conversations over the past day, the way Celtic tradition and Christian faith had been forced to find common ground in Arthur's original vision. The Grail is not a physical object. It is the recognition that the sacred exists in many forms, and our job is to honor all of them. The library around you began to shift and change, books rearranging themselves into new patterns that seemed somehow more harmonious than before. Nimue stood, her ageless features showing approval. Knowledge without wisdom is mere accumulation, she said. Wisdom without compassion is mere pride. You have demonstrated both understanding and empathy. The second test is passed. But as the staircase to the final chamber appeared, her expression grew grave. Be warned, Arthur Pendragon. The third test is the most dangerous, because it requires you to face the one enemy no hero ever truly defeats, which is yourself. All the parts of yourself that you would rather pretend do not exist. The crystal vessel pulsed once with inner light, then all three cups dissolved into particles of starlight that swirled around you before disappearing entirely. Whatever the Grail truly was, you suspected you would understand it better after the final challenge, if you survived the final challenge. The third chamber was not a room at all, it was the throne room of Camelot, as it existed in legend, vast and golden and perfect in every detail. Banners hung from impossibly high walls, depicting the arms of knights whose names were carved into humanity's collective memory. The round table dominated the space, its polished surface reflecting light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And sitting on the throne that should have been yours was yourself, not a reflection, not an illusion, another version of you, wearing Arthur's crown and royal robes, looking every inch the king that legend demanded. But his eyes held a coldness that made your blood freeze, and when he smiled, it was with the expression of someone who had decided that compassion was weakness. So, the other Arthur said, his voice carrying authority that made the very air vibrate with power, the pretender finally arrives. Come to claim what you think belongs to you. Who are you? I am who you could become, he replied, rising from the throne with fluid grace. Arthur Pendragon, freed from the burden of caring about the weak, the foolish, the unworthy masses who drain a kingdom's strength. I am the king who puts Britain first, always and without compromise. You understood immediately what this was, not just a test of strength or wisdom, but a confrontation with the darkest possibilities of absolute power. This was Arthur as Aaron saw him, Arthur without restraint or mercy or the complications of serving others. I am nothing like you, you said, But even as the words left your mouth, you felt the lie in them, because you could feel the temptation, the seductive simplicity of ruling without having to consider every voice, every need, every competing demand for justice. Are you not? The dark Arthur gestured around the perfect throne room. Look at this place, everything exactly as it should be. Every citizen knowing their place, every problem solved through decisive action. No committees, no compromises, no endless debates about what is fair to whom. He was right, and that was what made this so dangerous. There was undeniable appeal in the idea of cutting through complexity with simple authority, of ending suffering by eliminating anyone who caused it, of creating peace through absolute control. And what happens to those who disagree with your vision? They learn to agree, the dark Arthur replied with casual brutality, or they learn the consequences of defying their rightful king. This was Aaron's vision made manifest, not evil for its own sake, but righteousness taken to such extremes that it became indistinguishable from tyranny. And you could feel how easy it would be to slide down that path, especially when you had the power to enforce your will on anyone who opposed you. No, you said, drawing Excalibur. A true king serves his people, not the other way around. Naive child, the dark Arthur laughed, producing his own blade identical to yours, but radiating malevolent energy. You still think ruling is about making everyone happy. Let me teach you what it really means to be king. The battle that followed was unlike anything you had experienced. This was not combat against an opponent. This was war against aspects of yourself that you had never wanted to acknowledge. Every strike he made found weaknesses in your defenses that you had not known existed. Every counterattack you attempted met responses that anticipated your moves before you made them. You are weak, he taunted as his blade slipped past your guard to open a cut across your shoulder. Weak because you care about people who would never care about you. Weak because you hesitate when decisive action is required. And the terrible thing was, part of you believed him. In the heat of combat, you could feel frustration building, not just with this fight, but with the entire situation. Why should you have to prove yourself worthy? Why should you have to consider the needs of people who could not even comprehend the sacrifices you were making? That was when you realized the true nature of this test. It was not about defeating the dark Arthur. It was about acknowledging him without becoming him, accepting that the capacity for tyranny existed within you while choosing compassion anyway. You are right, you said, lowering your sword despite his next attack bearing down on you. I am weak. I hesitate. I care about people who will never understand what I give up for them. His blade stopped inches from your throat, confusion flickering across features that mirrored your own. And that, you continued, is exactly why I deserve to wear the crown, and you do not. Because strength without restraint is not strength, is fear. And a king who rules through fear rules over nothing but his own isolation. The dark Arthur stared at you for a long moment, his sword wavering. You would choose to be vulnerable, to remain weak. I choose to be human, you replied. To remember that power exists to serve others, not to serve itself. To accept that being king means being the first to sacrifice, not the last. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, the two of you faced each other across a divide that separated kingship from tyranny. Then the dark Arthur smiled and, this time, the expression held warmth instead of coldness. Well chosen, he said, and began to fade like morning mist. Remember this moment when the crown grows heavy and the choices become impossible. Remember that your greatest strength lies in admitting your limitations. The throne room of legend dissolved around you, leaving only medieval stone and the sound of your companions rushing up the stairs. In the center of the now normal chamber sat a simple wooden pedestal, and resting upon it was a crown that seemed carved from captured sunlight. St. Edward's crowned the coronation crown of British monarchs, but somehow transformed into something that belonged to legend as much as history. As you approached it, you could feel the weight of 15 centuries pressing down like a physical force. The final choice, came a familiar voice. Aaron stepped from the shadows near the chamber's entrance. But he looked nothing like the enemy you had expected. This was not the bitter, power-hungry usurper your imagination had constructed, but a man who looked startlingly like you, older, sadder, carrying the weight of centuries in his eyes. "Brother," he said simply, "I wondered if you would make it this far. You are my brother, half-brother, technically. We share the same father, though I was born of different circumstances." Aaron moved closer, his hands empty of weapons. "I have watched you face the tests, and I admit you have surprised me, by passing them, by understanding them." He gestured toward the crown. "Most who attempt these trials see them as obstacles to overcome. You saw them as lessons to learn. That was not what I expected. You kept Excalibur ready, but did not attack. And what did you expect?" "I expected," Aaron said with painful honesty, "another version of myself. Someone who wanted power for its own sake, who saw the crown as a prize to be won rather than a burden to be accepted." He moved to stand beside you, both of you looking at the crown that represented everything you had been fighting for. "Do you know why I gathered the tile with Teg? Why I awakened the old powers and challenged the modern world? To claim the throne, to force you to prove yourself worthy of it," he corrected. "Because I have seen what happens when unworthy men wear crowns, and I would rather Britain have no king at all than another tyrant who rules through fear and ignorance." The admission hung between you like a bridge across an impossible chasm. You orchestrated all of this ... as a test. The threats were real enough. If you had failed, if you had chosen power over service or strength over compassion, I would have destroyed you and taken the crown myself. But you did not fail. His smile held genuine pride. You chose to be weak so that others could be strong. You chose to serve so that others could be free. And now, Aaron stepped back, his expression growing formal. Now you face the final choice. Take the crown and accept the responsibility it represents, not just to Britain, but to the balance between the human world and the powers that shaped this land before humanity existed. Or walk away and live as Elric Blackwood, ordinary man with an extraordinary education. You looked at the crown, feeling its weight even without touching it. Taking it would change everything, not just for you, but for everyone around you. There would be no more quiet academic life, no more simple choices, no more pretending that you were ordinary. But around you, you could feel the presence of your companion Zelena, with her fierce loyalty. Tommy, with his struggles to balance faith and magic. Professor Marana, with her deep knowledge of things that officially did not exist. Marcus, with his dedication to protecting what mattered. Marion, with his ancient wisdom wrapped in modern understanding. "I am not ready," you said honestly. "No one ever is," Aaron replied. "That is what makes them worthy." You reached out and lifted the crown, feeling its weight settle onto your head like destiny finally clicking into place. Power flowed through you, not the raw force you had felt during the trials, but something deeper and more complex. Connection to every living thing within your realm, responsibility for their well-being, the burden and privilege of serving something greater than yourself. "I accept," you said, though the words seemed inadequate for the moment. Light exploded through the chamber, not blinding, but warm and golden and filled with promise. When it faded, you were no longer standing in the White Tower. You were back in the great hall at Camelot, surrounded by your knights and advisors, wearing a crown that felt both foreign and perfectly natural. "Your Majesty," they said in unison, and for the first time, the title felt earned rather than inherited. Outside, you could hear church bells ringing across London, announcing to a world that did not yet understand that its greatest legend had returned to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The round table was complete once more, and the real work was about to begin. Epilogue. 6 months later, you stood on the balcony of a building that officially did not exist, watching London wake up to another day in a world that had quietly become stranger and more wonderful than most people realized. The city looked the same as it always had: dread buses navigating ancient streets, commuters hurrying toward underground stations, tourists queuing outside historical sites, but you could see the differences that others missed. street lamps that flickered in patterns that warned of supernatural activity in distant neighborhoods, ravens that carried messages between operatives scattered across the British Isles, gardens where flowers bloomed out of season because they were tended by hands that understood older magics than modern horticulture. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Professor Morana said, joining you with 2 cups of tea that steamed with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "How are you feeling about today's agenda?" You accepted the tea gratefully, noting how she still used your title with the same mixture of respect and gentle mockery that kept you grounded in reality. Nervous, excited, slightly terrified that we are about to make everything significantly more complicated. Today was the day you had chosen to make certain truths public, not the full extent of magic and other world politics, but enough to prepare humanity for the changes that were already beginning, whether they acknowledged them or not. Archaeological discoveries that could no longer be explained by conventional history. Environmental phenomena that suggested the Earth itself was awakening to new possibilities. Technological innovations that seemed to operate on principles science had not yet discovered. "The cabinet meeting went well yesterday," Professor Morana continued, settling beside you against the balcony rail. "The Prime Minister took the revelation that the Arthurian legends are documentary rather than fantasy better than we expected. Probably helps that we solved the energy crisis with those renewable systems Marion designed," you replied. "Amazing how receptive politicians become when you can demonstrate practical applications for impossible technologies." Below you, Marcus emerged from the building's main entrance, dressed in his usual business attire, but moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how the day would unfold. He was coordinating with government liaisons, international observers, and media representatives who had been carefully selected for their ability to handle information that would redefine their understanding of reality. "Any word from our European colleagues?" you asked. "French intelligence confirms that similar awakening events are occurring across the continent. The Germans have established their own version of the Round Table, though they are calling it the Iron Circle. The Scandinavians never really stopped believing in their old stories, so they are adapting fastest to the new reality." Through the windows behind you, you could see the great hall where Alina was conducting final briefings with the knights who would be revealed to the public today, not as legendary figures returned from the grave, but as modern professionals who had inherited ancient responsibilities and adapted them to contemporary needs. "Sir, Alina of the New Round," you murmured, remembering the ceremony 3 months ago when she had accepted formal knighthood, "has a nice ring to it. She still insists people call her Director of Historical Preservation during business hours," Professor Morana noted with amusement. "Some traditions take time to establish." Father Tommy appeared in the doorway, wearing clerical collar and an expression of barely contained excitement. His role as liaison between the Round Table and various religious organizations had turned out to be one of the most important positions in your new administration. "The Archbishop is ready to make his statement," Tommy reported. "Official church position is that recent archaeological discoveries confirm the historical basis for many traditional legends, and that faith and magic are not incompatible when both serve the greater good, and the Vatican, still debating, but the early signs are positive. Turns out they have been quietly investigating supernatural phenomena for centuries. They are actually relieved to have official channels for cooperation." You finished your tea and checked the time. In 30 minutes, you would step before cameras that would broadcast your words to millions of people who thought they understood the world they lived in. After today, that comfortable certainty would be gone forever. "Any regrets?" Professor Morana asked quietly. You considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, you had been Elric Blackwood, graduate student with a thesis deadline and student loans to worry about. Now you were Arthur Pendragon, King of Britain, in ways both symbolic and practical, responsible for managing the return of magic to a world that had forgotten how to live with wonder. "None," you said finally. This feels right in ways I cannot explain to anyone who has not experienced it. Marion appeared beside you with his characteristic disregard for normal methods of transportation. One moment the balcony was empty, the next he was there, wearing robes that seemed woven from morning mist, and carrying a staff that definitely had not existed moments before. "The otherworld representatives have arrived," he announced. "They are waiting in conference room 7, though they may have transformed it into something more suitable for interdimensional diplomacy." How much more suitable? Well, it appears to be a forest glade now, complete with a spring that speaks in 3 languages and deer that understand parliamentary procedure. You laughed, still amazed by how quickly the impossible had become routine in your life. Of course it is. Are they still willing to recognize human authority over the borderlands? As long as that authority is wielded by someone who understands that power comes with limitations rather than freedoms. Yes, Marion's ancient eyes studied you with approval. They were quite impressed by your handling of the Manchester incident last month. The Manchester incident where industrial magic had gone wrong and threatened to turn half the city into something from a Tolkien novel had been your first real test as king. Solving it had required not just power, but the wisdom to know when not to use power, when to negotiate rather than command. "Ready?" Alina asked, emerging onto the balcony in dress uniform that combined medieval symbolism with modern practicality. Behind her came Marcus, Tommy, and the rest of your council, the new round table, adapted for an age that needed legends to be real. You looked out over London one more time, seeing it with eyes that could perceive both its mundane reality and its magical potential. Somewhere in those streets were 8 million people who were about to discover that their world contained more wonders and more responsibilities than they had ever imagined. "Ready?" you said, adjusting the crown that had become as natural as breathing. "Let us show the world what the round table really means." As you walked toward the press conference that would change everything, Excalibur rested comfortably at your side, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of service. Behind you, your knights followed with the confidence of people who knew they were making history. Through the building's windows, you could see Eren in the garden below, tending to plants that bloomed with colors that had no names in human languages. He had chosen to serve as royal advisor on otherworld relations, finding peace in helping bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern necessity. "For Britain," Alina said quietly as you reached the door to the conference room. "For the future," you replied, and stepped forward to meet whatever came next. In the distance, church bells were ringing, not in alarm this time, but in celebration. The age of hidden magic was ending, and the age of integrated wonder was about to begin. Arthur had returned, the round table was complete, and the real adventure was just getting started.